Well, good morning, church. 14 years ago, at the tender age of 52, I celebrated my first Father's Day as a grandfather, thanks to this guy. That's Ian's birth picture. He's a lot taller now. I told everyone that asked that I was far too young to be a grandpa. But as you know, you don't really have a say in the matter. I mean, once you have children, the question of whether or not you'll become a grandparent or when is completely out of your hands. But despite my own youthfulness, I've grown into the role over the years, and I do enjoy being a grandfather. It helps that our children are amazing parents who have raised, so far, a total of 7 outstanding grandchildren. Any unbiased observer would be able to see that. And I do have pictures of my grandchildren, but I don't know how to get them from where they are to something that will let me put them up for you to see them. You know, and as soon as I say that, I realize now all the women are thinking, "Aw, now we want to see the pictures of your grandchildren." You know, and the men are thinking, "You remember what they look like, right? I mean, you could pick them out of a lineup, so what's the problem?" So let's get back on track. So now I've got some years under my belt, and I can see some things in the scriptures that I might not have seen or appreciated as much when I was younger. And our passage for today, Psalm 71, is a good example of a passage that holds a lot more meaning than I realized earlier in my life. Have you ever gone to your dad or your grandpa to see if he has a tool you need for a project you're doing at home? You go and he'll say, "Well, let me see if I got something in the garage or the basement or the tool shed." He'll rummage around for a while, and then he'll hand you something you've never seen before, and he'll say, "This ought to do the trick. Let me show you how to use it." Or maybe you've asked for help with a problem that you're facing or a question about something you need to make a decision about. And he listens to you for a bit, and he says, "You know, back when I was just getting started in my career, a friend of mine told me something that helped me from that day on." And then he shares with you a little bit of wisdom that he's used over the years. Well, the psalm that we just heard read for us is a lot like that tool that your dad pulled out for you, or the bit of wisdom that your grandpa remembered and shared with you. Let me explain. You see, the author of this prayer in Psalm 71 to us isn't told us. The psalm doesn't tell us who wrote it. It is included in a collection within the book of Psalms that's ascribed to David. But what is more telling is that the first 3 verses of this psalm are almost identical to Psalm 31, verses 1 to 4, which is said to be from David. And as we read the rest of the 2 psalms, which I've just put the beginning of it up there for you, we read the rest of those 2 psalms, it becomes very clear that Psalm 31 comes from a time when David was younger. And Psalm 71 comes from a time when the author is an older man. So either an older man is composing his prayer in Psalm 71, and he's using David's words that David wrote earlier as a guide for him as he begins his prayer. Or what I think is more likely, though not certain, but more likely the matter, is that David himself is recalling his earlier psalm. He's now applying the opening words to his new situation as he is an older man. And that's why I've entitled this sermon today, A Grandfather's Prayer. You see, the author of Psalm 71 is an older man. He's pulling out a very well-used and well-trusted tool from his tool belt. And this is a tool he has used often, and he knows it very well. See, when you're younger, you're learning new things all the time. You're developing skills, developing your facility and using the tools of your particular trade, whether that is welding or bookkeeping or web design. And as you get older, you keep learning, or at least you should. But you also develop familiarity and confidence in certain tools that become your favorites. And they're your go-tos when you need something done. And that's what the psalmist is doing here. He's using a familiar, trusted tool, a prayer that helps him recall God's faithfulness. Faithfulness that he has witnessed through the years. And he reminds himself as he calls on the Lord that the God to whom he is praying has answered him in the past. He has delivered him from danger in the past. He has rescued him from his enemies time and time and time again. You see, trust, whether it's trust in a tool or trust in a person or trust in God, is something that's built over time. Developing trust requires frequent small steps in the same direction, repeated experiences over a long period of time that builds up confidence. And confidence is not the same as bravado, right? Confidence isn't a matter of posturing or boasting. Confidence is having an expectation that's based upon proven dependability, strength that's been tested, established value that's been verified and found to be true. So the psalmist is recalling the faithfulness of God throughout his life. And the words that he has borrowed from the past are signals that remind him of specific times that God has helped him, of frequent encounters with God over the years that have built his confidence in God, that have strengthened him in his relationship with God as he has put his trust in the Lord, and the Lord has proved himself trustworthy. Now in his old age, he is again facing enemies, new enemies that threaten his life. Or perhaps he's still facing some very familiar enemies who continue to harass and attack him. Because the wicked are all about him, and he needs God's protection, he needs God's deliverance. Excuse me. One of the things that happens to us as we age is that we become more aware of the evil that is around us. I'm not talking about just getting cranky because the things that we like are being pushed away by others in order to bring in the things that the young folks like that we think are ridiculous. I'm talking about real evil, not just preferences. As we age, we have more experiences with which to measure the world around us, and we have more experiences of being cheated, of seeing criminality go unpunished. We have more experiences of seeing people break the law and get away with it, maybe even profit by it. We see senseless wars and more corruption and more foolishness that gets enshrined in institution and laws. And so when you're young, you see these awful things happening in the world and you want to change the world and make it better. And so you set your sights on doing that. You're convinced you're going to make a difference. And as you age, it's easy to become cynical. Because despite the good that's come from your efforts, it doesn't seem to have made a lasting impact. And you see evil that's still just as entrenched as it ever was, and it doesn't look like it's possible to root it out. And that's when the psalmist pulls out his trusty tool, this familiar prayer. He knows that what he needs is God, because there's no other help that's adequate in the face of the enemies that are pitted against him. There's no other help that can defeat the wicked who surround him and the evil that he sees both around him and within him. And so he returns to his refuge. He goes back to his fortress, to the place he retreats to when the attack is overwhelming, the place where his defense is the strongest and where he can hold out. So the psalmist reminds himself of what God has done for him, because God is his fortress. And he reminds himself of what God did for him when he was younger. He reminds himself of the truths that God has taught him through the years. And he rehearses, both mentally and verbally, the faithfulness of God. He rehearses how God has proven himself over and over in specific times, specific ways that he can recount. It's like when he says to that wrench, I remember when you helped me. He says to that web design tool, I remember this used to work. He recounts for himself the times and the events that have given him reasons to trust God when God's strength and God's saving power have been evident. In our own family, I'm talking about our family, all of our kids have gone through some tough times in the past couple of years. And what has been so wonderful for us to see is that as each of them has gone through these various challenges and trials, all of them have reminded one another, that is, all of our kids have reminded one another of all the ways that God has helped our family, beginning before any of them were born, and continuing through the times that they can point to as children, to the times they can point to in their college years, to the times they can point to now in their adult life. And Mary and I have listened as they have rehearsed the stories of God's faithfulness to one another, as they have rehearsed His provision, the stories of His deliverance, the stories of His help. And we've watched them retreat to God's fortress, to the rock that is Jesus Christ, and they found their strength in Him. Rehearsing those experiences and the truths that God taught you is what enables you to become what the psalmist said he had become. He says, I've become a sign that signals God's ability to others so that they can know that there's a help available for them as well. When we rehearsed God's faithfulness for our kids, we became a sign for them, an indicator of God's ability. We became a signal, an indicator light, something that they could point to, something they could recall when they faced the challenges and the enemies that were harassing them. And our testimony of how God had been faithful to us and to them helped them strengthen their resolve to trust in the Lord and allowed them to build their own confidence in God. And then when they rehearsed God's faithfulness for each other, they were strengthened even further and helped each other deepen their confidence in the Lord's faithfulness. But as I think about it, there's not much that's more useless than a broken indicator light. Right? But one that works is absolutely crucial, no matter how small it is. If you and I are supposed to be signs for those around us, we need to be on. And when we rehearse God's faithfulness, what He's done for us, when we tell others and remind ourselves of the goodness of God and of His salvation and His rescue and His provision for us in our times of need, we can have a big impact. Because we serve as this crucial little indicator light that points the way to the solution that others need. Now we come to the heart of the psalmist's prayer in verses 9 to 14, because he is in genuine need. It's approaching desperation. And he's painfully aware of two very critical realities in his situation. The first of which is that he's weaker than he used to be. He's lost a step. And secondly, while he's lost a step, his enemies continue to mount their attacks. It is a hard thing, particularly for a man, at least I have found it so. It is a hard thing to recognize and come to grips with the fact that you reach an age where you can no longer do at all what you used to do with ease. You no longer can do at all what you used to do with ease. Where you once had great strength and ability, you now are left with the unreliable memory of what you once were capable of doing. And it's usually signaled the first time that son beats you in basketball or beats you in whatever. You're on the downside of this hill. I've often quoted the saying on the t-shirt I saw once, the older I get, the better I was. But meanwhile, the world rumbles on. Because history marches forward and brings with it new challenges that quickly overwhelm your diminishing strengths. And your enemies are relentless. You might defeat some of them, but new and more powerful ones arise to replace the ones you've beaten. And you're in a weaker state. And it doesn't really matter who or what those enemies are. They can be your competitors in business or opponents of your worldview, your religion, or your political persuasion, your political position. It could be new challenges that exceed your capabilities, or it could be your own ongoing personal frailties. It could be physical ailments that come with old age, or spiritual powers that are as old as the heavens themselves. What matters is not the specific kind of enemy that you're facing. What matters is that they are threatening your peace and your home, your livelihood, your nation, you. And it matters how you'll respond. The psalmist's enemies mock him. They consider his faith in God misplaced. Either his God is impotent and unable to deliver him, or else he has abandoned him altogether, leaving him on his own in this weakened state. And so they planned their attack. Folks, that is happening today for every one of you. But the psalmist turns to God. Do not cast me away when I'm old. Do not forsake me when my strength is gone. His cry for help is combined with a determination to trust. He reminds himself his hope is not in the inevitable victory of progress. That is a delusion. His hope is in God, who alone can save him from his enemies. I'm not going to go off on this tangent, but the so-called inevitable victory of progress, being on the right side of history, is a delusion. It's a false hope. Things don't always get better. So our cry for help has to be to the one who's able to save, not just in American optimism. And it's combined with this determination to trust. I'm not just going to cry out for help. I'm going to trust the one who I believe can help me, because I've reminded myself that my hope is in God, and I do not listen to these mocking voices. I listen to the voice of my own experience with a God who has saved me time and time and time again in the years. I recall God's faithfulness, and I choose once again to trust Him once more, to put my hope in the one who saved me before and is going to save me this time as well. And then we come to verses 15 to 18, which are, I think, the key to the entire prayer. Because it's in this portion of the prayer that we see not only the psalmist's choice to turn to God and his determination to trust in God, but we see his comprehension of the need to tell others of what God has done for me. He cries out, "Do not forsake me, O God. Do not fail to help me until I can tell the next generation what you've done." The psalmist recognizes he stands in a special place. He's an older man. He has experienced God's help throughout his life. He can testify to God's salvation, to His power, to His faithful love that's been demonstrated in specific times, specific ways over decades. And he has an audience who needs to hear it, who needs to know what God has done for him. Gentlemen, as older men, as fathers and grandfathers, and even if you don't have any children, you can still fulfill the role of a spiritual father or grandfather, as Josh said so well as we started this service. You and I have a holy responsibility and a sacred opportunity to share what God has done for us with our children and with our grandchildren and with the next generation. Nothing that God gives us is just for us. Whatever God does for you or teaches you or gives to you is never for you alone. It is always given to us so that we may share it with others, because we are stewards, not owners. We are always and only temporary managers of the gifts and the resources that God puts in our hands. Now, I know there's a real easy excuse for not trying to pass on what we've learned from God, what we've experienced with God. I've probably said it. I know some of you have said it. The young people don't want to listen to me. They just spend all their time staring at their phones. Well, you might be relieved or chastened or I don't know what to realize that, or to maybe you didn't know this, but older people have been complaining about younger people for at least 2,500 years. I mean, if we believe Socrates. There actually is a way to bridge the gap, though. And it starts with befriending them. When you befriend your children and grandchildren, you listen to them. You engage with them in the things that they like to do. And as you build your relationship with them, you give them a reason to listen to you. And the things that you share about God and what He has done for you, then they have weight, because they don't sound like moralizing lectures or angry complaints. They sound like help from someone who loves them, and they want to listen. So tell them your stories. Let them know what God has taught you. Let them know what Jesus has done for you, what the Holy Spirit empowered you to do when you were afraid. Tell them about what God delivered you from, how God rescued you and how He provided for you. Let them know how God shaped you to be who you are, and how unlikely that was given what you used to be. Tell your kids your story. The story of your faith and the story of your spiritual battles and the things you've learned. Tell your grandchildren about their walk with Jesus. About your walk with Jesus. Tell them why you go to church and why that matters to you. Tell those within your sphere of influence about what God is doing in you and what He's done for you. Now, please don't assume that anyone at all knows the lessons that God has taught you. We have this tendency as Christians to think, they know I'm a Christian. They know. They don't know. Unless you tell them, they won't really know what God has done or given you. You know that God transformed you from what you used to be to what you are now. People around you just think you're a nice person. And they never put two and two together just because you go to church. Because if they don't know Jesus, they also likely think, well, church is this club for nice people, and that's where we remind each other to be nice. And they don't know what it is that made the difference in your life. So don't assume. Tell them what Jesus has done for you. Now, the closing verses of this psalm focus mostly on the psalmist's declaration, his intention to proclaim the praises of God and tell others who God is and what He's done. And really, that's what true worship and true praise is. It's not just singing great music in church. It's proclaiming to your world who Jesus is and what He's done for you and for the whole world. And if you'll take these verses to heart and start praying them out as your own prayer, asking God to help you carry them out, you'll start seeing a change in your own outlook and in your day-to-day interactions with those around you. But there's a really neat little nugget that's hidden away in this closing section, verses 20 to 21. Though you have made me see troubles, many and bitter, you will restore my life again. From the depths of the earth you will again bring me up. You will increase my honor and comfort me once more. When we read the Old Testament, we find very little written about what happens after death. Even today, Judaism is primarily a religion about this life. It's focused on the matters of this life, ethics and behavior and community and so on. But in this prayer, which is probably from David, we have a hint of a belief in resurrection. And I say probably from David, because even though we don't have a specific inscription that attributes to this to David, we see in other psalms that David did write these same hints about resurrection, such as Psalm 16. And that, plus the use of Psalm 31, for me, tipped the scale in favor of David as the author. But whether David wrote it or some other author wrote it, what we see is that this person clearly anticipates God's intervention on his behalf after death. Verse 19 extols the righteousness of God, and the psalmist is very aware of his own failings. He trusts in God to bestow God's righteousness upon him and to bring him up out of the grave, to crown him with honor and bring him everlasting comfort. So even though it's fairly undeveloped, it's still not much more than a seed. We see a hope, an expectation that God's salvation will not only involve delivering me from my enemies so I don't die, but will deliver me from death itself and transform me and bring deliverance from the grave so I can live eternally in the presence of God. And because he has that hope, the psalmist makes his final declaration: I will trust in the Lord. I will continue to proclaim what God has done for me all of my days and throughout eternity, and I will pass on to the next generation the good news of God's salvation with specific testimonies about what God did for him. Because of his hope, he insists, I'm going to tell someone else about it. By the way, if you'd like to tell someone, we'll take testimonies and let you speak here. Just a thought. So, my fellow dads and grandpas, telling others that you can do is a gift that only you can give this Father's Day. We who have the clearer promise of resurrection because of the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ have the greater responsibility and the greater opportunity to share that hope with others, beginning with your own family. I hope you'll take care to do that. I hope you'll take hold of that opportunity. Maybe start later today while you're around the grill with your kids or your grandkids. Make sure that they hear from you, not from your wife, from you, what God has done for you and what He can do for them. Men, that's your one job today. Well, besides manning the grill and the remote. That's your job. Let them hear what God has done for you.